Okay, welcome again. We're going to start right now with Sophie's presentation. Everything should be fixed on the technical level. We strongly hope so. And so we can start. Konstantin, do you want to say something? No. Sophie. Do you have the...
Oh, the clicker? No. Das ist die Version von gestern, oder? Das ist die Version von gestern, oder? Das ist die Version von gestern, die ich geschickt habe, oder?
Ja, ich habe die...
Ja? Okay, passt perfekt, ja. Okay, so, yes? Okay, so I heard that we can start again. I hope you're all very much awake already. I will try to, I don't know, keep you engaged so that you will not fall asleep. Good, so we are going to talk a bit about a different topic because it's not going to be about rental markets, but more generally housing markets. Yeah, I asked Konstantin whether he would be interested also in housing markets, not only rental markets, and he said it's okay, so I'm presenting this one now.
I'm not 100% sure that they downloaded it yesterday.
Okay, I sent two versions. The only difference is that one has a nicer graphical representation. If it's not there, you will not see the nicer graphs, but then you have to look at the numbers, I'm sorry. But I think it's fine too, then you have to look at the numbers. Anyhow, so what we're going to do here, the exercise we're doing here is actually one that was inspired by receiving stupid referee reports a bit too often, always criticizing the type of data to be used for studying any effects on housing markets. So pretty much when there are any external shocks on housing markets, you can always test within a hedonic model, for instance, what are the consequences of these external shock on the housing market. That is the case in many different ways. Whatever shock is happening that is not internally from the housing market, but comes from external sources to the housing market. And then all these referees were very nasty, often saying you have to only rely on deeds, so final transaction prices, because that's the only true prices. However, what I would say and what we argue here is actually that's not true. It really depends what type of shock it is. And I think it should be done, hopefully, in the future by everyone to classify shocks before along several dimensions, to anticipate what are the right data to detect consequences in the housing market accurately and timely. So this is really a bit like very methodological, but hopefully somehow useful and maybe also something that will be used in the future to address any concerns when you're not sure which data to pick, what is the best data to do and what is the right measurement technique. Yes. So that's a bit like what we try to do here. Okay, and that's not working? Oh, it's off. Oh, maybe that's why. Okay, so this is just an example. So here we have advertisements on the left-hand side, an index based on advertisements, and then we have an index based on brokered advertisements. So these are advertisements where the agent has said that this advertisement has been concluded. There is a contract on the way. So this is kind of final transaction, also the final transaction price. And we plot the index, so it's a hedonic time dummy index, like as a step function. So you see really accurately when the index really is changing. And if you, for instance, want to have a look how are lockdowns affecting the market, then we just look at very plain indices like that, you may actually have the feeling nothing happened. However, when you look a bit more in detail and actually adjust the measurement method, everything is actually revealed, and then a lot actually happened is revealed. And I'll show in a bit why this actually may be the case, and why sometimes it's not that effects are not there or not visible, but rather it's the choice of the researcher. And probably this may actually be problematic in many papers out there and many analyses out there. So what we really try to do is to develop a taxonomy to give some guidance how to measure which data depending on the type of shock. So it's a bit methodological, sorry, it's a bit technical, that may also be a bit boring, I'm sorry, but I hope it's useful. Okay, so that's the principal goal, how to holistically measure the effects of macro, not necessarily macro, but very often macroeconomic shocks that originate not necessarily within the housing market, on a country's housing market. So we're looking really at an entire country. So that's why you can also really talk about macroeconomic shocks, because look at the entire housing market of a country. And then actually we have this 3-dimension, what type of shock it is, and we classify it whether it comes from the supply side or it comes from the demand side. So who is actually the leading party that is changing behavior? So that is one dimension. Then the question also, is that something that is supposed to happen immediately or something that is gradually evolving? Depending on that, different measurement methods should be applied. And then the question is also, and that is something, particularly in housing market, very crucial, do you expect that prices are affected, or do you expect that volumes or counts or quantities are affected? When you look at housing markets, very often quantities react so much stronger than prices. This is also what we actually have seen over the last year. Quantities were the real problem. Transaction volume was the real problem. That absolutely dropped. Prices, to a certain degree, but not necessarily everywhere, but quantity has heavily dropped. Yeah. So in that sense, we try to classify and then say, like, you may want to use this method or that method. Okay. Yes, so that's a bit the idea. We develop a general framework and demonstrates also its feature using a sequence of 3 disruptive shocks that just naturally happen somehow. So we are just waiting for the shocks to happen, and they did, that were affecting the Austrian housing market. We do that not because Austria is particularly interesting, but we just got access to 3 pretty cool data sets which you can use for this analysis. Okay, so that's, I have mentioned it a bit already. So the first dimension is prices versus quantities. A lot of people are arguing with me, is that really quantities? You may also call it trade volume. So what you mean here is really trade volume. Yeah. I call it quantities for the rest of this presentation. Some macroeconomists find that really bad. Whatever. Immediate versus gradually evolving, and then again led by the supply side. That would be sellers or owners, so the potential supply side in a certain way, versus the demand side, that would be buyers or potential buyers. What we need for that is one thing that we all know, hedonic house price models, right? Given that we do that for an entire country, we cannot go for a plain linear model for that, but actually use a hierarchical model, because that gives us all the structure of having different layers. Also given that, I mean, Austria is also, we have some mountainous regions, they are definitely very different than the inner city in Vienna, right? But the hierarchical structure of the model actually allows us and gives us the flexibility we need for that, because also variant structures are very flexible. But besides the hierarchies, it's pretty much the same as a standard hedonic model. And then what we also develop is what I call here quasi-hedonic count model. It's not really hedonic, it's just kind of also a model that models the quantities, the volumes. So we're not just counting numbers of transactions or number of advertisements and things like that, but we put that into a model framework, because that allows us to test in the same way as we can in a price model, also in a volume model, which is quite nice because it links sequences in time to each other. The same way as a model for prices links different house transactions together, also the volumes are linked together. And then we can also systematically test within the quantity model. Yes, and on top we also need 3 data sets to give guidance of what is supposed to react first, how to measure. And what we use here is first quite standard, so we use advertisements. They are supposed to be quite representative for the housing market, also pooling many different sources. And then we have standard also notary deeds that are collected centrally in Austria. And then we also have an intermediate things, which we call brokered advertisements. So when an agent is used for selling, which is for most transactions done nowadays, they would use any portal to advertise it. And when the deal is sealed, so to say, that means when the real estate agent signs the contract and receives the money, that is much earlier than when transactions are recorded by notaries. There can be a lag of up to 6 months between really the kind of setting of the final price and then the recording date when we would see it then in the data. And that means actually that these are transactions for the subset of those transactions that use real estate agents. However, it's very timely. So that is almost as timely as advertisements. Doesn't have this additional time lag notary deeds have. Yeah? So that's why we can actually use these 3 different data sets to also then test our hypothesis. Okay. Yeah, so, and we do not collect the data by ourselves because that would be a bit crazy. We actually collaborate with, they call themselves still a startup. I think they're more established by now, but they call themselves a startup, so they're collecting all this data, digitizing it, and so on, and yeah, trying to do fancy stuff with the data. Usually the seller data, we use it for free. Yes, and the notary deeds come from the Grundbuch in in Austria. That is all so somehow digitalized, so at least we get not many characteristics, but something that are centrally collected by the system. Okay, and we look at 3 shocks. First was, maybe remember, there was a pandemic at some point, right? So we look at that as a shock first, and particularly we look at the lockdown periods. So Austria was a bit crazy. I think we had 6 lockdowns or so. Our government just liked to have lockdowns all the time. So we're actually looking at how does that affect the market. And then we also have, right now, inflation with interest rates hikes affecting also how expensive are mortgages. So that's actually the link we have in mind. And then, that's actually funny, just in between, Austria was really nice to also introduce a bank lending standards. So something that was actually enforced to a certain degree by the EU, but Austria was one of the last countries to actually implement it, because before we had no lending standards. Banks could just do whatever they want in terms of issuing mortgages, and now it's the first time that there are actually harmonized standards banks are supposed to follow in terms of who should get a mortgage, under which conditions, and things like that. Right. So these are the 3 shocks, and then we actually measure what is happening with the housing market. Again, they are all not directly affecting the housing market, but all somehow indirectly, but they should also or have some effect, right? Okay. Right, so if different event periods, just, yeah, anyhow, given when that happened. Right, and in general what we do, we estimate separate models for prices and quantities, and then we classify each shock. What would we expect? Should it be gradually? Should it be immediately? What are the different consequences of this shock? And then we actually add a lot of what we call crisis proxies. You could even think about it like an instrument in some way, so something that is instrumenting the crisis within our model. So some indicators that are correlated strongly with the emergence of a crisis, something characteristic for the crisis. Okay. Right, so we use different variables for that. So for the pandemic, we use First of all, the lockdown periods. Most importantly, that's actually the core of our results. But then we also look at mobility behavior. So we could use Google mobility data to see how is mobility actually changing, which is very much correlated with lockdowns, but not only. And then we also were looking, maybe people would care about death at COVID. Turns out they don't. So the severity of the pandemic in that sense turns out to not be a really good predictor for what happened on the housing market, but the other two are. For bank lending standards, we look at the dates of policy enactment, but then also on the number and quantity of new loans. So what was issued after the policy and before. And then we call it now the cost of living crisis. So we look at CPI and inflation rates. We look at mortgage interest rates, so really what was issued by banks for getting a mortgage, and also the policy rate by the ECB, given that this should be a bit earlier than mortgage rates. Okay, right. So we have all this data, plus the 3 data on house prices. Try to visualize it a bit here, and merge it all together. Okay, I think I don't want to go about that. It's just the structure of the hierarchical model. So we have 3 locational structures that are nested within each other. So that's how we set up the model. So we have, actually we are on the individual transaction level. That's where we start. That's where we model most of the things. But then we go on the district level and then the federal state level. So in Austria we have 9 federal states, and they tend to be a bit different, right? And then we go up to the national level. So that's our allocational hierarchies, plus the full set of hedonic characteristics, which you would see here, that is added then on the individual level. Right, so that was the price model, and now this is the quantity model. So quantities are usually not normally distributed. I mean, economists may assume that, but it's usually not the case. But it's actually something you are counting. So how many transactions do we have per week? So we tested first with a Poisson distribution, whether that would fit. Didn't fit, so negative binomial is similar, but a bit more flexible. So we put that all into a model that assumes negatively binomially distributed counts per week. So we do that. That is our response variable. We normalize by population size, because this is very much linked to each other. And then we have also some characteristics that are then testing what is going on. Most importantly, unlike prices, we see strong like a cyclical trend. There's seasonality in transactions. That's why we also include an annual trend into the model, modeled here via trigonometric functions. Okay. And then we develop for each crisis 2 hypotheses, one for prices, one for quantities, and then systematically test, given with this event-specific indicators, or we call that contextual variables here. You could also call them instruments, something like that, right? Okay, so for instance, for the pandemic, what we would expect is that we would expect to see an immediate price drop during periods of restrictions, particularly at the very beginning, because there was a lot of insecurity. People didn't really know what was going on, and probably the last thing people were thinking about was selling houses, right? So we would actually expect that, so that prices here, but also quantities should really drop, particularly at the beginning. That may continue with later lockdowns, but it may fade out at some point. We don't know when, but that's what we would expect. But then also there were a lot of discussion, when you think back, that people like to live differently. So people want to have open space. So they don't want to be locked into small apartments that do not even have balconies or things like that, if you have to spend like lockdowns there and things like that. So there's a lot of discussion, so we actually want to test whether those properties also did increase in prices that have these features in comparison to others. Similar also, I mean, we can all work now like remotely, as we also see here. Some people are remotely here. That also means that maybe non-urban areas really gained in value because more people demand that, right? So we may also want to see or test whether these areas were particularly strong in increasing prices. That's something we would not expect immediately to happen, but over an extended period of time, if more people are actually demanding that. Right, and also like the other side, if you are in very small areas, small apartments without any nice amenities, probably those properties may decrease in value in comparison to before. Okay, so that's just a timeline when we had lockdowns. You see we had lots of them, right? Austria was really good in that. And that's a bit like what we find. So I don't show you, I mean, I decided to show that mostly graphically. Believe me, there are all the models behind. You could also see that when you look at the regression tables, but we thought like graphical is a bit more intuitive. And this is actually what you see. So the red index is the one that includes lockdown indicators, correctly linked to the hedonic transactions that happened during lockdown periods. And then you actually see, okay, advertisements were immediately reacting on periods of restrictions. So there was a huge decrease while there were these kinds of restrictions. There was absolutely no trade going on, but those people who were trading were happy to actually accept really lower prices than what was seen before. And that was very much really linked to the periods of restrictions. So timely, perfectly visible when you look at advertisements. When you then look at final transactions, it's all shifted to the right, which makes totally sense, right? Because you can only then, I mean, also notaries were not working well during that time, although most is digital, right? But still not everything. There were still some meetings necessary at some point in time. So you actually see the shift to the right. However, you would see in the advertisements for immediate effects that they are perfectly linked to the lockdown periods. But these were no long-lasting effects, not at all. They were catching up immediately. What about open space? So in some way a change in tastes. So what we do here, we would expect that to happen gradually. So that's why we link it with time dummies within the model and then test whether over time those properties gain much more in comparison to other ones and in comparison to pre-trends. That's what we see here. If we normalize it all to the beginning of the pandemic, we actually see that single-family houses, those were the ones that really gained the most, so with a lot of open space. And if you look at apartments, those that also have these amenities were also increasing much more in prices than all the other apartments, exactly what we would expect. And you also see that advertisements do show that a bit, but this is a trend that actually is a change of taste by buyers. Not sellers. Buyers do care of having these amenities. So you actually see final transaction to show that much more stronger than advertisements, right? Because advertisements would be the thoughts of sellers. They don't really react to that. However, the demand side, when they're jointly determining the price, you see it there. So probably there was much more demand for these properties in comparison to others. Similar with urban areas and regional ones, also that was driven by the demand side. They were asking more for these properties. Also in terms of dwelling type, again, like single-family houses were actually the winners of the pandemic, we can say. Okay, then we go on, because we don't really have time. Quantity effects, we would expect that during periods of lockdown, everything is dropping, including sales, but that should recover pretty soon. That's what we would assume. And then depending on the phase of the pandemic, that effects should fade out. That's what we thought. Let's see what the data says. Yeah, it's the old presentation. So I would have had sorry. There would have been a graphical representation of that, but either way, you actually see that with COVID, there was really a heavy drop in quantities, much stronger than prices. So that was the real source of disruption, that it was not the price, yes, also prices, but the quantities were severely dropping. Probably also because it was not easy to do that, to seal deals like that. And they were perfectly linked with lockdowns. And also, you see that this was a strong effect at the beginning, but then also faded out. Maybe also because also notaries at the end found ways how to have kind of deals, how to sign contracts and things like that, even without personally meeting. So lockdowns were not really an issue anymore. And you actually see beautifully this fading out process. You also see a link with reduced mobility, another indicator of lockdowns. Depending on how you look at it, the sizes are a bit differently. But again, when it is about like the severity of the pandemic in terms of mortality here, we also looked at the number of cases and all related things. People didn't care about that. It was really the restrictions that was hindering trade, and we can really measure that within our framework. Okay. We then actually repeat this entire things for the other two crises. Again, would classify first, then systematically test through. And usually what you find is when you apply, when you think before you test, a bit like like when you do an experiment and you register and you have a plan how to test before, and you follow it, this gives you a lot of guidance, and then very often everything that you would obviously expect to see, you also see. And if you use the right data according to the demand-supply perspective, you are very often also seeing exactly what you are expecting to see. If you use the other or the wrong data in some way, you don't see it, or only maybe a lagged effect, or smaller than it really is. So in that sense, we try to convince people to look before testing, and then if possible, if you have access to all these different data, choose the appropriate one. And that's it. Thank you very much. It's maybe too early, I fully understand that.
We will have time in the afternoon,
Yes,
during the discussion tables. Okay, so next presentation, Violetta.
Okay, thank you. Good morning to everyone. My name is Violetta, and I am a postdoctoral researcher at University of Turin. And today I'm presenting you housing tenure and subjective poverty among young European adults, the role of rent regulation, which is a work with my co-authors, Professor Mariana Filandri and Silvia Pasqua, both from University of Turin. So our paper starts from the high risk of poverty experienced by young people in Europe. The identification of situation of these economic disadvantages is usually measured through objective monetary indicators of income or wealth poverty. However, we know that the subjective poverty can be equally important to identify target population of anti-poverty policies. This is important because the subjective poverty is linked to different dimensions of well-being, and this is also relevant because subjective poverty can affect several aspects of our life, of current and future aspects of our life. For example, subjective poverty can reduce our consumption levels independently of household income. On the other hand, subjective poverty can affect the social participation of individuals, and also subjective poverty can affect the fertility choice and future projects such as economic investment. In addition, the self-perception of economic hardship is important because it takes into account several factors at the same time, such as the context, individual and household socioeconomic characteristics, and also relational factor. However, the research on the mechanism that influence this subjective poverty is underdeveloped, especially among the young people, that we know they are more likely to feel poor in times of economic crisis with respect to world population. And, but in this respect, looking at the housing market, previous literature show that European homeowners are less likely to feel poor than renters. And these advantages is related to both the economic security and, for instance, life satisfaction attached to home ownership, and especially the outright own ownership. However, this relationship between home ownership and subjective poverty may also be the reverse for young people, especially for young homeowners with mortgage. In this case, homeowners with mortgage, like renters, are less protected from the rising of housing costs, for instance, from the rising of mortgage interest rates that directly affect the subjective poverty. And in this paper, we argue that maybe stricter rental housing policies can mitigate these disadvantages. And then in our study, two main research questions are addressed. The first, what is the relationship between tenure status and subjective poverty among young adults in European countries? And then, does rent regulation influence the association between housing tenure status and subjective poverty? And then, as I said before, we expect to find that in all European countries, outright home ownership is negatively associated with subjective poverty compared to mortgage home ownership and rented accommodation. And then we expect to find also that the difference between mortgage owners and renters disappear when we control for income level and housing cost burden, because both types of tenure status suffer from housing insecurity. So, at macro level, we know that housing policies can affect processes of social exclusion. In particular, several studies show that rental housing policies can reduce the risk of living in material deprivation or worsening living conditions, not only for renters, but also for other social groups, such as homeowners. And in these studies, we focus on two types of rental housing policies, such as the stricter measure of rent control, from protecting young adults from rising rents, and then social housing that provides affordable rental options for young adults, for especially low-income households, as an alternative to the private market. And then at macro level, we expect to find that rental housing policies affect the ability of renters to make ends meet because they feel protected by state intervention. And then we expect to find that rent regulation policies will give young mortgage households the feeling of having an affordable way out should they lose their home because they are unable to meet their mortgage payments. And then for what concerns the methodology, our analyses are based on USILC, cross-sectional USILC survey data. We collapsed three waves, 2009, 2013, and 2017, for 28 European countries. In this case, our unit of analysis concerns young independent households aged between 18 and 34. Then, at micro level, our dependent variable involves the subjective poverty, measured as the ability of households to make ends meet. In this case, the variable is measured on 6-point scale, from 0 that involves households that make ends meet very easily, to 5 that involves households that make ends meet with great difficulty. And then our main independent variable concerns housing tenure status, and it's classified into three categories: renters, outright homeowners, and mortgage homeowners. And then we control our model for several confounders at micro level. And then we can move to the macro level variables. We consider the first indicator at contextual level is the rental market regulation. This is a variable that concerns a composite index ranging from 0, where when involves the absence of rent control, to 1 that corresponds to the stricter rent control. Then we consider the percentage of households in social renting, and it is measured through the percentage of all households in social housing within a country. And then we construct a third variable that is a composite rental index that is the combination of the two indicators mentioned above. And then also in this case we control our models for several confounders at macro level. And then, given the structure of our data, we estimate several multi-level linear regression models with a 3-level random effect specification. In this case, the households are nested in country waves, which in turn are nested in within countries. And these strategies is used because we can test if the housing policies can affect the relationship between subjective poverty and housing tenure status through cross-level interactions. In this case, we decompose the effect of macro-level variables in between and within the components. In this presentation, we focus on between components. That is the country average of a macro-level variable over all waves, which captures the between country differences. And then here there are the first descriptive results. We can see from this graph the average subjective poverty of young adults for each European country. We can see that there is a certain level of heterogeneity across Europe, but we can distinguish mainly two partners. The first partner relates to the Western and Northern European countries, where young people reports they are less likely to feel poor, and we can see that the levels of subjective poverty are above, below the European average. And then we consider the second partner that involves Eastern and Southern European countries, where young people report greater difficulties, greater economic difficulties, with levels above the European average. And then here we can move to the multivariate results, where we plot, the graph reports the multi-level regression models. In this case, we focus on the micro level, where the dependent variables in this case is the intensity of subjective poverty. And we can see from the coefficients that both renters and mortgage homeowners are more likely to feel poor than outright homeowners. And this result is consistent across all models. We started from the model 1, where we include only the predictors at micro level. Then we add the macro-contextual level variables, the control contextual variables, and then we add the rental housing policies. And then this result confirms our hypothesis that only outright homeowners are protected from the feeling of subjective poverty when we control for income level and housing cost burden. And then we can consider the coefficient of housing rental policies. In this case, 2 out of 3 macro-contextual variable reports that when 1 standard deviation of rent control increase in rent control, it corresponds to the decrease in subjective poverty. This is consistent for the rent control variable and also for the rental index. But then we want to know if these rental housing policies can affect the relationship between subjective poverty and housing tenure status. In this case, we focus only on the significant coefficient, and we can see that all, in this case, the green coefficients, in blue also and red, all coefficients are negative. This means that when there is an increase in rent control or rental index, the subjective poverty decrease for both outright homeowners, mortgage homeowners, and renters. And you can see better the results if you look to this graph. We plot the predicted the coefficients for the model 6. Okay, for the rent control variable, and you can see the predicted values of average subjective poverty by housing tenure status. And you can see from the graph that when the standard deviation of rent control increase, the gap between renters and outright homeowners decrease, and this is true also for the mortgage homeowners. And this result confirms our hypothesis related to the fact that housing rental policy, in this case rent control, has an effect on both renters and mortgage homeowners and reduce the gap between outright homeowners and renters and homeowners with mortgage. And then to conclude my presentation, our results show the relevance of subjective poverty among young adults in Europe. In fact, the subjective poverty is widespread among these social groups. Our results show also that each tenure status is associated with a specific level of subjective economic hardship. And then at macro level, in particular, our results show that rental housing policies can reduce young people's subjective poverty and the gap in feeling poor between renters and homeowners without mortgage. In particular, we can say that higher level of state intervention makes the rental sector more affordable, but also influence the housing market as a whole, reducing its rigidities and making it more accessible to young people when they decide to enter the housing market. However, further discussion is needed because we found that rent control seems to be more effective of social housing. In this case, maybe social housing doesn't represent a feasible option for new young generation in Europe. And that's it. My presentation ends here. Thank you for your attention.
Now it's working? Yes. Thanks for the presentation. I was wondering, because usually the subjective poverty measures correlate super strongly with objective measures of poverty too, right? Did you cross-check whether your results hold when you use a conventional poverty measure or classification?
For,
being below a certain poverty rate or so, or being below, like, I don't know, 50% of the median income or something like that.
we control for the income quintiles.
No, not controlling for it, but just whether your results are exactly the same when you use, instead of subjective poverty,
Yeah.
objective poverty.
Like a dependent variable.
But they should probably, right? I mean, it would just make the results much stronger if it holds for both measures.
No, I mean, it works, absolutely, and also we tried to use also the wealth poverty measure. I mean, we use the income poverty and then also the wealth poverty measure. But the problem is that I mean, the relationship could be the reverse, because if you don't use longitudinal data, for instance, you cannot control, I mean, the poverty state before housing, and then the poverty state after housing.
Thank you. I'm Silvia Pasqua, one of the co-authors. I don't know whether I understood your question, but what we find in other papers is that there is not a perfect overlapping between objective and subjective. Yeah, but there is an increasing number of people that, even if are not objectively poor, feel poor. So the problem with these people is that they probably behave as if they were poor while they are not. Okay. Also not so at risk of poverty. So the literature on the relationship between objective and subjective poverty say that no, yes, there is a correlation, but there is not a perfect correlation. At least this is what we found in other papers. So yes, in fact, we control for income. I don't know whether this was the question.
Very interesting presentation. I know that the silk for tenants make a distinction between tenants that pay market prices and tenants that pay below market prices. Are you making this distinction, or are you just combining all of them in one category? Because it really makes a big difference.
Okay, I know the problem. It's an interesting suggestion. The problem is that we collapsed all renters in Europe, because the problem for instance, in countries such as Denmark, Sweden, and Netherlands, in our data, in Silk survey, you cannot distinguish between renters that pay at reduced price and renters that pay at private. In the private market, and then we collapsed all the categories. But maybe we can check. In the robustness check, we can distinguish. We can use only countries where the distinction is. We can distinguish these categories.
I know that for my country, for Malta, it really makes a big difference. I would like to give an example. Those paying below market prices might be paying 200 euros per year. The other ones will be paying 8,000 euros per year. So it makes a big difference for the subjective. And I'm not familiar with other countries, but you must make this distinction, because otherwise you will be comparing the
No, I know, because the problem in USILC is that you have these two categories and you cannot distinguish, households that live in proper public social housing and, for instance, households that receive housing allowances, and you cannot distinguish these categories, but we can try, we can try in the models, Silvia. We can try to distinguish between these categories. But it is difficult in USILC data, because you have a high level of heterogeneity within each category.
Hello. In your conclusions, you say, in the last conclusion, you say that, I don't understand if it's an outcome of the study or if it is another kind of conclusion, because then you say that higher levels of state intervention makes the rental sector more affordable, but also influence the housing market as a whole, okay? But then you say reducing its rigidities and making it more accessible to young people entering the market. But these two things is what I think the study said, it's the opposite, because the market is reduced, the number of houses available in the market is reduced, so it increases its rigidity, and makes it more difficult for young people to enter because the rents get higher. So I don't know if this is the perception of the people, or is it a conclusion that you have?
Because in this case, you mean that rent control policies can have a negative consequence in the housing market?
It's what the studies usually say. So it's the opposite that it's written here, I think.
Our interpretation involves that making a more affordable housing market for young people, the housing costs in this case for housing costs, makes the housing market with less rigidities for housing people.
But maybe Konstantin might explain better than me, but I think that's the opposite that happens, no? It's because there are less houses in the market when there is a rent control system. So the rigidity of the market is bigger because you will find less houses. As the prices increase, then of course young people and everybody have more difficult to get into the rental system. So sometimes it's more cheaper to buy a house than to rent, because you introduce all these measures. But
no, I understand your comments. We are discussing the negative consequence of rent control on the housing market for young people. But there are also positive consequences.
But the positive consequences are just for those who are already inside the market.
Well,
okay.
That's very interesting topic, and I think we can discuss, and we shall discuss it in the break. Thank you very much. So now we have the last presentation in this session. So
Okay. Yes. So my name is Sofia Borushkina, and I will present a paper that we wrote together with my co-author Alexei Kiselev, and that will hopefully be published next week, because I just got the proofs, so you will be able to read it really, really soon. So it's also nothing about rental market, it's about buying property and selling property, and we will discuss how the typology of housing being built, how homogeneous or diverse it is, influences the outcomes of policy of introducing more and more built units and supporting new construction. So there is been lots of research last probably 5 years that generally demonstrates that more housing we build,
the cheaper it generally becomes. So, like, we add new, even unsubsidized units, and it relaxes a bit the rents and the prices in the vicinity, but in the longer period also in the city in general. So that's why what we call here like market rate housing supply policy, so promoting more market rate units, has become quite widespread. However, there is also strong opposition for that. In the US, I think it's called supply skepticists. So basically, there is also certain experts and researchers that believe that if we add more units, it might actually be dangerous for in terms of affordability, because it actually can influence negatively on the renters, for example, on the most low-income groups, because what we add is usually more like luxurious or at least middle-up segment. So basically, all in all, the outcomes can be controversial. But in general, let's say, in most policy papers you find from most of think tanks anywhere on the planet, there will be an idea that we need to add new unsubsidized market rate housing in general, and so basically in order to make housing more affordable, we just need more housing. And there are lots of ways how you can do that, but what typically appears is a relaxed zoning, so basically allowing to build more dense, allowing to build more high, allowing more units to be in the project, giving more land for housing constructions, addressing also, the legal competition and all these kind of things. So there is sometimes interest towards we need also to build smaller, and maybe we need to think about industrialized ways to build housing, also to promote the amount of housing being built, but it's like, not very common, appears sometimes. But it will be what I'll be also talking today. However, what we've been interested in, that we found the policy debate in the UK about what kind of housing should be built or may be built. So basically there was a policy report that said that probably we need to make our developers build more diverse typology of housing, because it might increase absorption rate. So since we cover more different, families with different needs, people more easily find what actually works for them. That's why developers can, get out of old projects faster, switch to new projects, and in the end, they don't hold the land for longer, and we reach more housing construction, since we're kind of interested in that. However, we found only one paper estimating that, also based on UK data, that actually said it's not really working this way, but there was not so much explanation why. That's why we decided to exploit this idea, and we also know that actually, there is one elephant in the room, investors, who buy housing not for living, but for some other motives mostly. So, in general, the idea is the following. There are some regulation, generally speaking, and we know that probably if we allow more supply, generally the prices will be lower. It's more or less, clear. But if we allow more homogeneous housing, and intuitively we can think that probably if you allow more, then it becomes more unified if you pace up the construction, more homogeneous. So how it will actually influence in case there are investors in the market, and I think investors are now more or less on any housing market in the world. For the case study, we took Moscow housing market. For many reasons, we thought that it would be, first of all, we had access to data, but we think that it's actually a good case to test on, because first of all, it's a home ownership. It's called super home ownership. Basically, 94% of housing is privately owned, and privately owned by individuals. So we don't have big institutional investors on the market. They're only families and people who own the flats. There are typical new construction is a project of several thousand flats, pretty homogeneous. What else? We know from the developers who share the data with us that around 30% of apartments are now purchased by small investors. So if they ask people why you buy the flat, they will say investment. what else? Because there is like a very strong push from central government, they basically assign what amount of housing each city, each region need built in a certain year. City governments are kind of forced to relax the regulation a bit, otherwise they don't meet the certain standard that they are forced to build in a certain year. That's why there is, strong relaxation of all the regulation, for example, of how much housing can be built in a certain area in a certain year. So yeah, we did a bit of empirics to catch this effect, and then there was a model trying to explain how the mechanism works. So it's just to give the vibe how it looks like. This is a typical new construction in Moscow. So yeah, you see it looks quite homogeneous even from this side. But if we even discuss the typology, there are literally 8 types of apartments, only, so they're configured in a different ways. But significantly, if you see how much of typologies, it's literally 8 types of apartments, and that's it. So about data, we actually got a quite nice data set encompassing almost like 4 years, a bit more. We stopped at February 22 just not to deal with war shock, because we didn't know what to deal without data. So basically, for every single newly constructed flat, only newly constructed flat, we knew everything about it, and we knew like floor area, we knew the price at what is sold, the date. We also knew who purchased it. We basically knew the surname as well, but we also knew if it's an individual, it could be a company, but the most important thing that we knew is who was the previous owner. So basically in our data set, we discuss only buildings before the construction was finished, right? So it could be either purchased from a developer, or it could be purchased from whom we call investor. So basically I buy an unfinished property and then I resell it to someone else. This way, we could really clearly distinguish between like user motive. If I buy it for myself, that obviously I wait until it's finished and I can move in, or like my relatives move in or something like that. But if I resell it even before the project was finished, that I'm kind of clearly an investor. So we could rely on that quite well. So we were thinking about how can we measure, so we measure homogeneity on the project level. So first thing that we did, so we tried to understand if the project, within the project there is less variety, so it's very homogeneous, it becomes more attractive, so meaning that the share of investment purchases will be higher or lower. So first we did some more elaborate statistical techniques, but it didn't work really well in terms that it's already very homogeneous housing market, right? So it's not much, it's not unobservable at all, because we only discuss the constructions that are not finished yet. So basically everything we see is quite observable. So we used the proxy of like number of studios, which are like 25 square meters on average, and one room, it's not one bedroom, it's one room, flats that are like 32 now maximum, that are more, if they are more attractive, the projects where there are many typology like that are more attractive to investors or not. So basically there are some empirics that we can show. But all in all, the idea is the more homogeneous the project is within the less variety of apartments in the project, the more speculative investor purchases there will be. And we also adjusted for like the budget levels, because we were thinking, okay, maybe that's just because investors purchase the cheapest property, but it's not actually the case. So even if we adjusted for that, it worked this way. So, okay, at least we have this like indication of that the homogeneity and attractiveness to investors are connected. And then we tried to explain this through a simple search and matching model. I will not go in much of the details here, but basically what we were thinking that there is some match that's happening in the market. So some home buyers enter the market and they look for a certain property they like, and they can buy it from a developer. And also there are investors that come to the market and look for the properties they prefer. And we believe that families that are looking for property for themselves they are ready to wait on the market for longer to find that certain property that fits their needs better. And investors are more interested in doing it, buying or selling afterwards faster. And so they're kind of interested in like, tokens of apartments, not in apartments themselves. And this way, I mean, we will not go into details. I will just show some pictures of equilibrium. So when the homogeneity increases, the market becomes more and more interesting for those who invest, and not for those who, like we call them, end users. So because they are ready to wait on the market more, they have more bargaining power when the market is diverse, and investors vice versa, they have more power when all the units are quite homogeneous. It puts lots of pressure on developers, because if you have a certain amount of people that asks you that we need more homogeneous units because it gives us extra profit, then of course under this pressure you will build more and more similar typology. In Moscow case, it's just super small apartments. In 2022, it was like average size was 53 what entered the market. And it also, demonstrates how the market adapts not only quantitatively and, in terms of prices, to the presence or to the commodification of housing, to the presence of investors, but also qualitatively, because those who are interested in actually living in those flats often find difficult to find the flat that will fit into their needs. So I think that's basically it, and even because we took like quite an extreme example, because it was comfortable to test when you don't have so much, rent-related policy or something like that. But we generally think that there are indications of this debate going in other places of the planet, because if you are interested in quickly selling, quickly, buying, it's very comfortable if you don't really need, you can, basically estimate, for example, the value for property online without going somewhere else or buy it online. And in this ways, diverse property is more, it can contribute to the welfare of end users, but not to investors. So basically all that we wanted to say here is that probably also what kind of housing you build is also should be taken into account, because it also influences the outcomes of the policy of allowing more construction to happen. That's it.
Well, I have a question. So if I understood the initial motivation of the paper, we are talking about making the housing more affordable, or...
Yeah, in sense, we are talking about if we implement this policy, like if we believe that more housing construction contributes to like general affordability, it also matters what kind of housing we build, not only how much of this housing we build.
So in this
and the
case,
resultant outcomes, yeah.
So in this case, standardized housing, because I think it's also part of discussion in Germany, building prefabricated standardized houses will solve the affordability problem. So what's your answer to this question? Yes?
So without additional regulations or sub-schemes, it will contribute more to investors than those who are actually interested in solving their housing issues. Yes. So probably you can do some, smart taxation on the second, third property, or do something else to mitigate that. But if you at least don't implement this kind of thing, that investors will find it a very good deal, and homeowners and those who want to live there, not really. Yeah.
Because it's too standard. Because everybody wants to, not everybody, but many want to have an individualized housing, and this housing is just too standardized, too uniform.
Yeah, very comfortable to invest in them, but not very probably addressing the interests of families, let's say.
But you said actually they were much faster also, right? So maybe actually they buy it before people who want to live, so owner-occupiers can actually buy it because investors are just so much faster. Yeah, so maybe they would essentially be bought also by other people who want to live there?
So I can't hear you really well.
I'm just thinking because you mentioned that it's much faster when
Yeah.
investors are buying, right? So maybe those people are actually buying up all that stock long before the private investor that is just not that fast and searches longer is able to buy. So in that sense, it may not be that they don't like it, maybe they are just too slow. Can that be?
Yeah, you know, I think we actually tested this in data and it didn't work this. So, I mean, we didn't find indication of that in data, I think. Yeah, so for here we used only reselling properties like after a year of a purchase or so. So, I mean, we don't see much difference of when actually the investors enter the market, I would say. Yeah.
Seems to be very specific to a super home ownership place, because I imagine that if it's a big renting market, people, when they rent, don't care that much in detail if the specifications of the home are so perfect for their imagination. What do you expect that happens in markets where there's more renting than home ownership, where the importance of the specific, of having such a heterogeneous supply is maybe not that important?
Yeah, you know, I mean, maybe, to be sincere, first of all, I don't know. Yeah. But, I mean, let's say this kind of constructions can be problematic even for renters if they will happen. Because, I mean, for example, in this particular project that I showed you, 60% is like under 32 square meters anyway. So you understand that it will be like basically singles, 60%. And then will be, you know, there are nothing more than 2 bedrooms at all on the, like on new construction like that, which is also, you know, maybe it will be, you know, also a very specific place to live in a sense. So if you need more than 2 bedrooms in your apartment, then what you do, not fully clear, yeah. But probably, I mean, if the rental market is stronger, I think it will adapt better, to be sincere, yeah, because it's more difficult to invest, to use, basically, you know, not to use a house as a house, but use it as a token to resell after 2 years, because the price is the only thing that the price changed, the only thing that you're interested in, because if the, you know, like renters' rights are protected and it's much more difficult to get rid of them before the resale or something like that, then it probably will mitigate a bit. But, you know, we need to test that, I suppose.
Thanks a lot.
Thanks.
So today we are on time and we can celebrate it with tea, well, not tea, coffee, not tea.
It's just something not in the Italian mind. So I can have tea if you'd like. So if you'd like during the coffee to suggest topics for the discussion table, we put the QR code there again. So. Okay, we can start. If Nadine is online. Nadine, can you hear us?
Hi,
Hi.
can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you. Can you hear us?
Yes.
Oh,
I'm gonna share my screen.
Perfect, thank you.
Yeah, the one
And you
second,
have 25 minutes. Is everything all right? We can't hear you yet. Maybe Nadine, your microphone is not on. Yeah, it's off. Okay.
Hello, can you see my screen?
Yes.
Okay, I'll do a very quick introduction. I'm Nadine Bekdash. I work through an organization in Beirut called Public Works Studio, and we do research on urban issues and also on housing. Our in-depth research on housing started in 2014, but I also, as a researcher, have written a paper on. So I will present now as a form of looking at what rent control did to the urban fabric in Lebanon, and not actually the rent control per se, but the whole way of urbanization and the lack of housing policies, while reflecting on rent control. So a brief history. To know that rent control in Lebanon actually started in the 1940s. It was the only way of access, it was the main way of accessing housing in the city. People rented through, there was no other way of renting. So rent, it was always regulated by the state until the 1990s. In 1990, between 1975 and 1990, we had a civil war. And in 1980, there was a deflation of the currency. In 1990, what happened is that all rental contracts remained effective, but a new rent law, new market-driven rent law was issued. And this new, what this did is that it divided every new seeker for housing to rent would now rent through a law that has absolutely no regulation. The landlord can increase rent after 3 years. They can evict you with no reason. There's no way to determine rent. It was completely open, market-driven rent policy. But what happened is that the rent control for old contracts, for ongoing contracts since the 90s, they were still under old rents, so what was called old rents, so still controlled and have a very specific reasons of how a landlord can evict. Mainly to demolish the building, this was one of the reasons, and to pay high compensations that is related to the price of the square meter in the same neighborhood. It's important to know also that 53% of the city dwellers in Lebanon live through informal means, so we have a huge housing crisis. And most of the dwellers live in the cities, amongst them the poorest communities. And actually, Beirut is a city of talents. It has, historically, this is how people used to access housing. But since the 90s, another policy was effective. That was all the housing policy was reduced to home ownership through loans. But recently we had also another, like in the 80s, another devaluation of the currency and the huge economic crisis. So this policy stopped completely. So now people can't get access to loans to buy a house. And another big thing happened in 2014 when a new rent law was issued to get rid of the old rental contracts. And it's against this law that this presentation will be taking place. The housing landscape in Lebanon is characterized by unaffordability, mismatch between supply and demand. There's a huge urban renewal connected to displacement, and this is producing inequality, segregation, and spatial fragmentation. But a new rent law, like I said, passed in 2014, and this reflected the state's failure to set and enforce a socially motivated housing policy. So there is no housing policy when this law was actually issued. And just to very quickly talk about the issues in this law. This law was adopted without a policy. It was issued without other laws that were back then in discussion, for example, the rent to buy or the social housing scheme and transportation scheme for people living in the suburbs. So it was issued alone as a standalone law to get rid of all the old rental contracts. It could have been an opportunity to consider this housing stock as affordable housing to implement affordable schemes. We did tackle this through a competition that we called Pink Housing, but I will not go into this in this presentation. It does not in any way differentiate between old impoverished landlords versus real estate companies who actually bought real estate bought old buildings with old tenants just before the law was issued. It does not give any protection for elderly tenants who have no more resources and are not protected by any policy. There was a recommendation to keep tenants above 68 in their homes. And there's no housing policy, and a holistic approach was not adopted, but this would need an amendment to the law. There's also a confusion that is happening a lot because the law was actually issued in 2014, then amended in 2017. So the courts now we are in 2024, so according to this law in 2024, all rental contracts should have reached market value, and now all landlords can evict their old tenants. They are not protected by law anymore. But the confusion, now everyone is confused, is this implemented this year or in 3 years, because there was an amendment to the law. And each governorate in Lebanon is actually ruling differently. Also, when the law was issued, there was a fund to support tenants who cannot pay their landlords the market value, the increase in market value, but this fund was never established because the main reason behind the law was not actually to pay tenants, to pay landlords market value, but to actually demolish and build higher, and this, you will see this in the presentation. So the fund was never activated, and now with the new inflation of the currency, there's a big issue of how do you determine market value. Do you determine it on $1 to 1,500 Lebanese lira or $1 to 500,000 Lebanese lira? So the inflation was huge in the inflation of the currency. So it's important to know that this law actually received a lot of protests from tenants. They had slogans like rent has always been for housing, now it's only for investment. This law means sectarian segregation because also in the history of Beirut, the old rent and actually made neighborhoods religiously mixed because people would access to rent. And the Civil War did segregate the city. Our city, and we have the right to stay in it, so tenants are very aware that the new rent law is not about, they will not be able to find rent in the city, which has a very high square meter price, land prices, so they will actually be displaced from their city, not only evicted from their home. and so on. Also, there's the reflection on the relation between how do we determine rent to minimum wage. So with all of this in mind, and also one main thing is that when this law was issued, there's absolutely no data on where the old tenants are geographically and how many contracts of old rents do we have when the law was issued in 2014. It was based on no data and no studies. Its main argument was that now it's time to, the old landlords have had sitting tenants for too long, now it's their turn to get back their homes. This was the only argument. So we asked the question, we did a project called Mapping Beirut Through its 10 Stories. I just want to make sure that my voice is clear, right? Or being able to hear me?
Yes, we're able to hear
Yeah,
you.
I'm not talking to myself, okay. We did a project called Mapping Beirut Through its 10 Stories, where we mapped neighborhoods to understand and ask the question. It was actually research rooted in historicizing houses in relation to neighborhoods and addressing the question of how do people who are not covered by any property rights inhabit the city. It was mainly to see people who don't own property and who don't have access to loans, how do they actually live in this city? In this, we looked at the impact of real estate development at the neighborhood scale and the processes of selling and buying property through this research. So this is the city of Beirut. These are the pockets of where we actually did the research. We took several neighborhoods and looked into mainly neighborhoods that still have an old fabric in a city that's changing very fast. And we surveyed every building in these neighborhoods. We took neighborhoods from different locations in Beirut. And we did a building scale mapping. We wrote stories of evictions, looked at the impact of real estate development, looked at how property is being transferred, and we documented potential paths towards affordable housing by mapping the rent-controlled units, the landscape of housing arrangements, all abandoned buildings, vacant apartments, evictions, and changes in membership. So some of the things that I want to say as conclusions is that we found precarious modes of accessing housing. Most importantly, we're able to determine what does it mean to end the rent control regime. We found that actually these neighborhoods, there was an average of 23% of the population living in them through old rent. And we mapped the morphology of these neighborhoods. So for example, here what is blue and yellow is all buildings built before 1970. So for example, this shows a consolidated neighborhood that there are actually few buildings that have been demolished and built after the 1990. So the old fabric constituted 97% of this neighborhood, and our argument is that this is also possible through the old rent, because they have old rent tenants living in them. But we also found that the issue is not only in the rent control or the old tenants. The issue is with the new rent and how people are actually accessing housing and what it's doing to the urban fabric. So mostly new rent was unregulated, precarious, or temporary. So we found, for example, on Main Street, where historical buildings being transferred into Airbnbs or transformed into, if they're not being demolished, this is the other way that's happening, transformed into temporary housing and for tourists. We found precarious housing through subdivision of housing units and bed rentals. We also found a type of a non-market rental that is, it's a type of a new rent control, temporary housing, free housing, but it's mainly linked to communities with a sectarian, maybe the Armenians as a community. So communities were finding solutions. Also, we found that informality and way of accessing housing through informality is very much in the city, where usually it's more known that informality is on the suburbs of the city, but we found pockets of informal ways of accessing housing and access to land as well, and they're living in precarious situations. Another thing that we can deduce by stories and by understanding the whole theme of how things are happening is how the body of the tenants is becoming a site for the struggle. I will go back a bit before the law was issued in 2014. There was an incident that happened where an old building fell in 2012 in a Fassouh area and killed 27 people. Because of this, the falling of this law, which was said that many of them were old tenants and the building was deteriorating, landlords started doing a lot of protest and warning old tenants of similar fate and capitalizing on that vision to push for abolishing rent control. So they would they were saying that this is not our responsibility, all our buildings are falling, and this issue of renovation and rent control was very capitalized upon, and there were deliberate acts of destroying buildings in many neighborhoods, but they were hidden by warning signs and official municipal notices for renovation, but there were actually deliberate acts of destruction happening. And all of this can be understood when we look at how real estate has become valuable or how it's been conceived in Beirut. You see a lot of billboards or commercials emphasizing how real estate is an investment opportunity rather than a place of living, letting land as a place of living. And for example, to illustrate the story of demolishing buildings, this is an old building in Ain al-Mraisi with a great view. It has it's a two-story building with a great view, and any developer would think that it's good to demolish this and build a high-rise. So actually what happened is that you can see the pictures above of the people living in these buildings, in their apartments. They were evicted under the pretext that the building will fall. This is a historical building, which usually it's very hard to get a permit to destroy it, although there's no law that protects it, but it's harder to get a permit. What the landlord did is that he evicted them from a municipal notice, and then he actually started from the outside. He bolstered the building, but from the inside, he was actually destroying the building from the inside. And now this happened like 10 years ago, and this building is still like this until now. Also, you can see that there's a variety of actors that are stripping the old tenants of their symbolization and humanity. So we don't see them as citizens living in the city anymore. We see them just as an opportunity to get a land and to get money from the land and to invest in this land, in this real estate. Who are these actors? State Commissioned Service for Heritage Preservation actually did that. When we look, for example, again at Ain al-Mraisi, the building I mentioned is somewhere here. Sorry? Are you talking to me? Hello?
No. Please go on.
Sorry. Okay. So there was this heritage survey that said everything in green, which is heritage, it's okay if they're not listed, so it's okay if they get demolished, but we will keep the buildings that actually are on the forefront, so when a car is passing, can see them. So also, and usually they are empty buildings. And if we look, for example, at comparing these maps, the map which has all blue in it is actually owner-occupied or tenants or both until the 1990. And then you look at the other map in 2013, everything that is in red or orange is either a construction site or a new building being built. The old fabric which was not protected as a fabric itself, but as an individual building. This was a main drive also to evict all tenants, and the main it allowed this to happen because the protection of heritage was not thought of as in terms of a fabric rather than as individual buildings that are mostly empty. And if we look more into this more deeply, we see in another survey that we did in Beshura, we found that actually 10% of the buildings were abandoned buildings. They are old buildings that no one is doing anything with them because the issue is the land, is not the building itself or the life that it can inhabit. Although the old urban fabric is it's still there. But the issue of abandoned or empty buildings is a main issue in Beirut. You get more than, sometimes it reaches 20% in certain neighborhoods of vacancy in housing units, and there's no taxation for that. Other main player are the developers. They act as agents of displacement. We map the processes of selling and buying property, how it actually happens, and what kind of developers do we have. So we see a lot of developers actually buying land even way before constructing. So there's a kind of a monopoly, and a lot of them they are in the process of the eviction. So not the old landlord is evicting; it's the developer that is in this process. And many plot of lands are sold, and still the process has not happened. And like I said, this happened a lot before the rent control was, the new rent law was issued, because it allowed developers to buy land cheaper from landlords. In this case study, you can see that 20 families were evicted since the two plots were purchased in 2013-2002 by a Carnaby company, and it has all tenants in them. Here, for example, 3 real estate companies, all owned by the same investor, purchased plots with rent-controlled buildings before the new rent law was issued. This is a main way of making money that is unlawful. There's also an inheritance issue. So many landlords, because a plot of land is inherited by many family members, so they go in to start buying from small inheritors. So one inheritor would buy, and then they would go to the next, This is also another main issue of why having big companies buy small landlords. Many go into development agreements. So a landlord, an old landlord, and a new a company would make an agreement. So for example, here, this is 2 buildings, 25 units, 17 families will owe rent, 1 old owner and 3 empty. Some of the owners are making development agreements with real estate company to demolish, evict the tenants, so they're able to compensate them. And then with the new building, they get shares or they get apartments. Also, it's interesting to see at the local level how the local authority play a role in eviction. So many, and see the evictions as an intersection of the urban landscape, legal framework, and class with specific
Nadine?
age and, yeah.
Sorry for interrupting you, but your time is almost finished.
Do I have 5 minutes?
No, not 5 minutes, half a minute.
Half a minute? Okay. So we looked at how local developers play a role, and the compensation issues. What do I want to... Okay, I wanted to also say how this, the whole eviction process, how it changes the urban landscape, that although many people after eviction go outside of Beirut or seek home ownership, there's also a lot of precarity in this form. Also, a lot of eviction is happening to get more precarious tenants. So we evict all tenants to get, for example, Syrian refugees who we can, it's through the new rent law or without a rent contract, so they are living in more precarious situations. So a lot of these old rental apartments are becoming precarious living situation. Okay, I wanted to end that one of the projects that we have now at Public Works is a housing monitor, where people they are able to call about their housing vulnerabilities and what's happening, and by monitoring, we identify trends in housing injustices and advocate reform. So this project, this research project actually led to the formation of the housing monitor. I wanted to go into case studies that have to do with old rent, but I will not have time. I want to end that mainly after all of this research and understanding very well the housing precarity and the needs in Lebanon, we came to the conclusion that the only way to be able to have more housing rights in Lebanon is by having a new comprehensive right to housing law, which we lack, and we lack any solid institution for housing. And one of the main issues that we need is a rent regulation, because the main way of accessing housing has been through rent, and it's very precarious of being unregulated like the way it is. It's being market driven and no regulation is up. So the rent control, which is completely out of date and people pay low, far below market rate, cannot be solved without a housing policy and a new rent law that is also regulated, but with different set of criteria. Thank you.
Thank you very much. If there are questions that no, apparently there are no questions. So thanks a lot again, and we move to the next presentation from the neighborhood country, from the neighbor country. Inna, are you ready?
Hi. Hello.
Hi.
Hi, can you hear me?
Yes.
Oh, thank you so much. My name is Ina Goldfarb, and I'm a PhD student in Tel Aviv University at the Faculty of Law. And it's my first experience in such an international conference. So thank you so much for the opportunity to take a part of it. Today, I want to present you a brief view about the dual role of the Israeli government in determining housing policy. And now I need to share the screen. Just a second. And let's see that you see it. Just a second. Can you see it? Can you see the presentation?
Yes, yes.
Oh, thank you so much. Okay, so today I want to present you a brief view about the dual role of the Israeli government in determining housing policy as a regulator and as a market player. Since the establishment of the State of Israel in 1948, Israel's housing policy has undergone significant transformations. In my presentation, I would like to present the main points of the Israel's housing policy and its unique characteristics. I would like to analyze the changes that have been made and the government's role in the Israel's residential real estate market, especially in the last 10 years. By examining the state's efforts to increase the affordability and the accessibility of housing for all, this presentation will delve into the state's dual role in the housing market in Israel. Let's see. Okay. Since the establishment of the State of Israel, the Israeli housing policy has actually three main goals. The first goal was to assist with housing of millions of Jewish new immigrants from all over the world. According to the law of return, every Jew has a right to become a resident and citizen of the State of Israel. So with the establishment of the state, the government's urgent goal was to help the new residents. The second goal was to assist the weaker socioeconomic population in housing, either for purchase or for rent. At the early stage, the State of Israel developed construction projects to provide the public housing for the socio-economic necessities. And the third goal was to populate settlements outside the center of the growing state at the geographic periphery and near its borders. The housing policy has changed over the years. With the growing of the country and the diminishing number of new immigrants, arose the need to assist other and more veteran populations. At the same time, as the goals changed, the way the state intervened in the housing sector also changed. From 1948 to 1964, the central government's aid in housing mainly focused on building public housing for new Jewish immigrants. In the 1970s, the government gradually moved from deep involvement in the housing supply, manifested mainly in the construction of new housing units, to active participation related to the demand for housing, namely in regulating subsidies and supervising the supply. And from 1989 to 1995, the country prepared to receive about 1 million Jews from the Soviet Union by initiating public construction to satisfy the increasing demand for housing. And from 1995, the government returned to its previous housing policy and slowed down public construction. A central element in Israel's housing policy is encouraging ownership of housing as a social norm. There are many academic researches about the significant role of the house ownership for Israeli family. The empirical data shows that even if the rent of apartment is cheaper and more affordable for the household, there are many psychological and emotional reasons, which are maybe sometimes irrational in terms of cost-benefit ratio, but which make the families to do every effort to reach the dream of owning their own home. So over the years, a maintenance of the public housing has been neglected and has declined greatly. As a result, a social stigma developed according to which those who live in public housing are less successful and belong to an inferior socioeconomic status. Therefore, many families prefer to take huge financial obligations through mortgages in order to buy home ownership. As of July 2022, there were about 2.85 million housing units in Israel. About 2.03 million of these apartments are private-owned apartments, which are about 71% of all apartments. And about 803,000 are rented apartments, which are about 28% of the apartments. And about 17,000 apartments are managed as private housing for older people. The number of owned apartments is higher among older people, and the number of rented apartments is higher among young people. According to a new index of the Central Bureau of Statistics created to identify a family's ability to buy a house in Israel, or the affordability index, the ability to own property in Israel is actually disappearing, especially for young families. Using data from the Bank of Israel, the affordability index demonstrates that over 80% of young families under the age of 34 are unable to purchase an apartment. For all households, the rate inability to purchase an apartment is about 70%. So, as we can see, except during the crisis of the early 1990s, the government moved from a centralized policy of initiation, construction, and settlement to a policy that mainly regulates and supports the demand side by providing a subsidy for rent in accordance with the socioeconomic criteria set by the state. This kind of policy was definitely opposed to the previous policy that supported the supply and construction of housing in the residential market. The unique feature of the ownership in Israel is that the state is the largest landowner. Approximately 93% of Israel's land is owned by the state. And the state fully controls the allocation of this land for construction and provides long lease agreements for people to use land according to the lease agreements terms, which are also determined by the state. So the Israeli Land Authority is a state institute established to manage and regulate the state's land according to the state's policy. The state, via the Israeli Land Authority, controls the allocation of land, including for housing purposes. For example, for the lease fees or one capitalist payment, the Israeli Land Authority provides long lease agreements that gives the lessee the right to live and use the property built on the state's land for 49 years, with an option to prolong the lease for additional 49 years. Any additional construction on this land, including the expansion of an apartment, requires obtaining consent from the Israeli Land Authority and payment to the state for the additional rights. So, on the one hand, the state controls the uses of the land, the zoning process, and the allocation of land for new construction, and regulates all legal and economic aspects of the real estate market. Here are some examples. Controls through the Israeli Land Authority of land policy and land allocation for new construction, control for social housing, public housing, and rent subsidies, control over housing finance, including regulation and supervision of discounted loan for eligible populations provided by the state, and private mortgages supplied by private banks. Control of the prices of raw materials and the permits for construction workers. And of course, the control of real estate tax policy. Tax policy is the tax on capital gains from selling the apartment, the purchase tax for buying the property, and the tax on income from rent. During the last years, a desire to moderate the rates of demand for investment homes caused the significant reforms regarding the purchase tax that should be paid for buying an apartment in Israel for investment purposes or by foreign and not resident investor. The level of the purchase tax was increased from 5% to 8% to slow down the demand for investment apartments. On the other hand, the exemption from the tax on capital gain for selling the apartment by the foreign or non-resident investor was limited. In order to approve the exception from the tax for selling the apartment, such investors should provide a confirmation from their state of residency that they have no any additional apartments there. So the apartment in Israel is their only apartment. The state's housing policy has shifted from establishing public housing for the weakest population to providing financial assistance for rent in the private market. Over the years, the stock of public housing has shrunk. As of 2022, public housing in Israel only constitutes about 2 to 3% of all housing in the country. Only a limited stock of public housing in Israel could be found in the central areas where most places of employment and commerce are located. However, most public housing is found in the social and geographic periphery where there are fewer employment opportunities. This situation is similar to that in the United States, which is also known for its policy of providing housing assistance only for the weakest and the poorest people in society. However, the state's financial aid is often insufficient for renting an apartment in the private market in the desirable location. Unfortunately, a constant increase in prices of housing for rent, especially in the urban areas, at the same time as the increase in the prices of apartments for purchase and ownership, caused a real crisis and a situation whereby young families are unable to obtain housing at the price they can afford. As I noted above, in the state's early days, the government focused on the construction of public housing, discounted construction for ownership, and didn't support construction for private rent. Therefore, there has been almost no construction for rent as an economic branch for investment in the rental market. Thus, the rent supply of apartments mainly consisted of private properties. The later shift of government policy from establishing public housing to providing financial assistance for rent in the private market made the shortage of rent units, and as a result, the rise in rent prices. However, the government attempt to encourage the construction of rental properties without significant success. According to empirical research, one of the problems is that the subsidy proposed by the state to promote the construction of new housing for rent and some tax incentives are insufficient. As a result, the rent prices in the new buildings that will be built for rent will be higher than those in the existing buildings and will not solve the problem of the rental housing shortage in the high prices. The rising cost of housing, which is rising to the point of a real housing crisis, is one of the most acute issues in Israel today. The state's lands are managed by the Israeli Land Authority, which issues tenders and various plans for residential construction. Similar to other market players, the state of Israel, as a landowner, puts the land up for sale to entrepreneurs at the highest price they are willing to pay. Just a second. So many critics claim that the state's absolute control over the cost of land for construction, the amount of land available for sale, and the planning, regulation, and supervision of the implementation of the housing policy causes a constant increase in housing prices. There are some special programs arranged by the state to try to find a remedy and a solution to the families that can't afford to obtain housing. For example, there are two main programs. The first one, the program of price plan for the tenant. According to this program, the Israeli Land Authority provides a significant discount for the land, subject to the obligation of the contractor that buys the land to build residential apartments on this land for long-term rent or for sale at a discounted price lower than the market price. And the second known program is the apartment lottery for young couples. According to this program, the young families that do not have their own apartment can participate in lottery to try to win the opportunity to buy the apartment that will be built on the state's land in a lower price than the market price. Unfortunately, both programs provide very limited solution and can't solve the problem. Therefore, as a part of my research, I seek to examine the state's involvement in the housing market in light of the state's dual role, both as the owner of the most of the land in the country and as a central market player controlling the supply of land for construction and influencing their prices in the market. On the one hand, the state operates as a market player by controlling the distribution of approximately 93% of Israeli land owned by the state. On the other hand, the state controls the housing market's operation as a regulator and significantly impacts private players' behavior. The state's dual role in the housing market is unique to Israel, and I just wanted to present this phenomenon as a brief view of the necessary reforms. The right to housing is not explicitly included in Israeli law. However, it's indisputable that Israeli society considered housing and shelter as available right and a basic necessity that every person deserves regardless of their income level. So in my research, I will show that to find an appropriate solution for the affordable housing crisis in Israel, we should reform the government intervention and to separate the state roles in the housing market to improve the distributional implications and the efficiency of the housing market and the welfare of the Israeli society. So thank you so much. That's it.
Thank you, Inna.
Thank you. Any questions?
Yes.
Hi. Hi, can you hear me?
Yes, yes, of course.
Okay, thank you very much for the interesting presentation.
Thank you.
You explained this interesting scheme or interesting land ownership well in the state of Israel, that the state owns 93% of the land. And I'm wondering, what's the situation in the illegally occupied West Bank? Is how Israel builds a lot of housing there, and how do developers get this land? Is it expropriated? Or do owners of land get some kind of compensation? That's one question. And the other question is, why is housing much cheaper there and much bigger? That's at least like what I heard, that much larger housing units are built in the West Bank. And why is Israel building there if they have 93% of land ownership in Israel itself? Thank you very much.
I thank you for your questions, but unfortunately I don't sure that I can provide you a professional and very expertise answers, because my research is actually not about the West Bank properties, and what I try to discuss and to present you is it's not about the bank, the West Bank or other areas that are not. It's actually about central areas and more about. It's not about the laws and that are discussed the West Banks, because they are separate topic that is not in my research. So I can't say nothing about the prices in the West Bank. But what I say is what I try to present is actually the structure of the law structure of the land in Israel and the ownership of the land. It's not about West Bank, but the whole structure of the land, of the real estate structure in Israel. So that actually you have a very centralized control by the state as an owner and also as a regulator. And in my research, I want to say that any forces and controls that the state has also about the land, and also as a regulator and as a market player and the owner of almost all of the land in Israel. So it's something that should be reformed and modern because there are real crises in real estate, in the higher prices that are rising prices, and also for rent and also for ownership. And you have many, as I said, about 80% of young families that can't afford any purchasing of an apartment. So I'm very sorry, my answer is not completed for your question, but I can check it, and maybe I can correspond to you or something.
Thank you very much. Thank you. No worries.
Of course.
Other questions, also from the online participants?
Hi, Nadine. Hi. I can.
Okay, so we can go to our next presentation. Can Gib?
Now I can hear you. Can you repeat, please? Yes, of course.
We can't hear Nadine's question. What happened?
Hello?
Okay, yes, now we can hear you.
Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. I have a twofold question. That the assumption that if state doesn't own land, we will get more affordable housing. Where does that come from? Because in access to housing, it's in other examples, even if state markets or market driven. And do you think that actually by owning so much land, it's part of the colonial project? And Israel is a colonial project on Palestine. So by owning land, it's actually part of this colonial settler project. So it's not a de facto thing that the state owns so much land. It's part of how Palestinians were stripped of their land.
Thank you, Nadine, for your questions. But as I've said earlier, I can't discuss or give you any brief view about this kind of questions because this is not a part of my research. And what I've presented here was actually the structure that we have from the establishment of Israel and about the Israeli territory that is not disputable. So, and about this, the idea that maybe if we can separate the ownership from the state and to be it more private, I think that we have many research that we actually, for my own opinion, I have an economic view. So I think that if you have a more free market and free solutions and give all market players the freedom to make it efficient, and I think that it could be more efficient and more good for the welfare of all society if we can separate these roles. So it's my opinion, and I think that I want to deepen my research in order to make it clearer and actually to have some support to this assumption. So that's it.
So we can go on with Ken Gibbs' presentation.
Thank you so much.
Thank you. Okay. Ken, we can see you? No? Okay. Your microphone is off.
Yeah, I think it's on now. Is that okay? Can you hear me?
Yes, we can hear you.
Great, okay, I shall try and share my screen. Will it work? I hope you can see that okay.
Yes, yes.
Great, okay, thanks very much, and thanks for the opportunity to speak to you all today. My name's Ken Gibb, I work at the University of Glasgow, and I last spoke to Konstantin in December, I think, about rent control. In Scotland, this has become a really live and dynamic area. It's become very politicised. It was already very political, but a lot has happened in the last 6 months. So let me basically quickly take you through the story I want to tell. It's as much a political as an economic story, I think. So in the UK, we had substantive wholesale deregulation of the private rented sector in 1988, which created short-term tenancies or 6 to 12-month tenancies, very low, considerably lower levels of tenants' rights and free market rents. Perhaps some of the story is in the 21st century, starting in the devolved countries, a little bit of regulation of the sector. And that part of that happened because of the although government wanted to grow the private rented sector, it wasn't very successful for the first sort of 7 or 8 years after the big 1988 legislative change. But then it did happen, but it happened in a completely unplanned way because of, in large part, the growth of the buy-to-let, individual landlords, small-scale portfolio type investor who basically took private renting up as a pension alternative to the low returns for pensions elsewhere available in the UK in the period of low inflation and low returns. And more recently, in the last 5 years, we've had a growth, still very small as a part of the whole, in build-to-rent corporate investment, particularly in London, Manchester, Birmingham, and now in Glasgow and Edinburgh as well. I think the other thing to say is that after this spectacular growth in the private rented sector, where it doubled in size in about 15 years, there's now evidence that it's plateaued, and in fact there's evidence in Scotland that it's now starting to decline. So supply is declining, and the question is why is it declining? I think there are multiple reasons for that, one of which might in Scotland be to do with rent control, but we'll come back to that. But we've had a lot of non-price regulatory change, ending up in Scotland with the 2016 Act, which moved us from these fixed tenancies to an open-ended tenancy system where there are a number of finite reasons how landlords can get repossession, but also tenants have a 28-day period of notice that they can use to quit, sometimes do. And we also introduced something called rent pressure zones, which will be what I'll talk about in the next slide. So we had a lot of change, and in a sense, there was quite a lot of optimism and enthusiasm about the 2016 Act, that it would bring a kind of regulatory balance and allow a sector to improve in quality and thrive before COVID happened. And then another important staging point was in 2020, the government launched this 20-year housing strategy, Housing to 2040, where the private rented sector had a vaguely set out, but a generally positive role to play, and one in which it was hoped that the private rented sector would provide a quality market alternative, but be aimed less at lower income households and more at people who are choosing to rent the private rented sector, maybe saving before they went into the home ownership sector, etc. And at that point, it looked like the government's proposals for these rent pressure zones were not actually going to be implemented by anybody, so it seemed to have got stuck. And then everything kind of changed. We had an election in 2021, and the Scottish National Party, the biggest party, had a minority in the Parliament, and they formed a quasi, but a voting coalition with the Green Party, and that also involved 2 Green ministers being established in the government, one of whom was the Minister for Tenants' Rights, and who, on the point of the agreement with the Scottish National Party, pursued a policy of setting up a national rent control policy, and that's where we've been ever since. So there is now a housing bill in Scotland which is going through the Parliament, which has a national rent control policy attached to it, and that's the kind of thing that I'm going to get to in this paper. So let me start by talking about briefly the rent pressure zone model. This was essentially taken from a similar policy in the Republic of Ireland. It works in Scotland as a bottom-up, in other words, a local authority designating rent pressure zones where there's a sense that tenants are under undue stress because of rent increases, but they need to have quite compelling evidence that that's the case. And then ministers in the Scottish Government would approve a rent pressure zone, which basically capped rent increases at I think, CPI plus 1% for a period of years. No single local authority anywhere in Scotland has taken up such a rent pressure zone. And the main reasons for that, I think, are to do with the data burden and the evidence burden of establishing it, and also the fact that it's a fairly mild form of third generation rent cap, as it were. And there's also a sense that the data is pretty poor and that there's a huge amount of work that would need to be done by local government to be able to actually get the thing up and running. So the bottom line is that introduced at the end of 2017, never implemented at all. and also led some people on the left to argue that this was because this was always the plan, as it were, that the government was making only a kind of token effort to say they were going to regulate rents, where they actually made it quite difficult to implement it. And that's a very sort of cynical view, which I wouldn't necessarily hold to, but certainly that was a view that was widely held. So that's where we were through COVID, and as I say, the political development of having a more, to be honest, the Green Party were more radically disposed to a lot of policy areas, and that certainly the minister on who was responsible for the private rented sector took tenant rights portfolio very seriously. They had this pledge to have a national rent control policy. But then things intervened, got in the way. First of all, we had this, of course, as everyone did, a really major cost of living crisis with rapid increases in fuel costs and inflation. So for the first time in 30 years, we had 20 years, we had double-digit inflation in the UK. And the Scottish Government, without really any warning, announced a complete freeze on private sector rents for existing tenancies in the autumn of 2022. This was to be a 6-month complete freeze in private rents, followed by a 3% cap in rents, which only ended in April 2024. And there's now an adjustment period where subsequent rent increases are kind of capped in a very complicated formula, which I won't go into. But with a view that would stay in place until the legislation, which is now going through Parliament, would create a national rent control policy. So this sudden announcement was quite a cataclysmic kind of event. It was going to say completely unexpected. It meant that all landlords, private landlords, were obliged with existing tenancies to maintain rents at their current levels. Some of them would probably have done that, so they had a new tenant, to be honest, but that wasn't the case for everybody. And what this did is what many people said was bound to happen. Because they exempted new tenancies, that meant that new tenancies were an opportunity to increase rents substantially, and that's what people did. So we ended up with a kind of dual market where existing tenancies were frozen in aspic and didn't move, and people stayed where they were, because moving to a new tenancy bore the risk of bearing these rent increases, the kind of risk-adjusted higher rents that people wanted to pay. The other thing that happened is that the build-to-rent sector just dried up completely. New investment stopped. Some projects were suspended, but there's now a backlog of build-to-rent projects which haven't begun, and the investors, the pension funds, insurance companies are clear that they see Scotland now as a high political risk, and there's uncertainty about the future. So there's been disinvestment. So on the one hand, tenants have been protected in a cost of living crisis, but only existing tenants. They had major distortions in the rental market for new entrants and people moving in to live in the private rental sector, because that's where rents are rising, and rising strongly, rising disproportionately, arguably. And also there's been this disinvestment. So that's been quite challenging, and it's also created a much more polarised and politicised attitude to rent control in Scotland, where activists and people who can see the benefits to them directly are now much more stronger advocates of rent control going forward, knowing that this was a temporary move. But equally, it's reinvigorated the supply side in their critique of these things. But of course, a rent freeze is by definition a kind of much harder first generation type rent control in the context of stronger tenants' rights in the first place in Scotland. So we've now moved into this situation of a housing bill. The housing bill is about two things mainly. It's about homelessness prevention, and it's about the rent control procedures, and some additional tenants' rights on some more cosmetic issues, which I won't go into. So this arose over a period of time. And we were quite heavily involved in some of the discussion about what evidence there was about rent control in Scotland and such like, and we had quite a lot of discussions with ministers and civil servants around it. To be fair, we've probably dropped out of that discussion. We're now much more part of the commentariat, I suppose, on these things. So basically what happened was that they were very unclear about what the specific direction of the national policy would take until the last 9 months or a year. where they've basically said that this will be something called local rent control areas, which will be very similar to the rent pressure zones, will be identified, drawing up rental data at a local level, which local government will be able to demand from landlords, and landlords can be fined if they don't provide the rental data, which adds to what we've already got. We have a landlord registration system for every property in Scotland, but it just doesn't have many attributes. This would basically add these attributes in the form of what the rent is, what the current rent is, and the kind of type of property involved in the size of the property. And it would be for local authority to then say to government, allow us to have a rent control area, and there'll be some rent cap. Now, the rent cap's not specified in the legislation, so it's not clear how different it would be from the rent pressure zone. So this is kind of why I call it RPZ, rent pressure zone 2.0. It's not at all clear how it will differ from it in practice. It's one thing it will differ from it is it's for existing tenancies, but also for new tenancies, where it's straightforward to identify what the rent would have been previously in the new tenancy. It's a problem for new build. They're probably going to exempt or disallow new build properties in the private rented sector. There's also some debate about whether the build to rent institutional investment might also be exempted or disallowed as well. So there's some dubiety over exemptions, there's some dubiety over the rates that will apply, there's some dubiety about the precise mechanism by which the procedure will work. What's definitely clear is that it will take at least a couple of years for the system to be up and running, and then the data has to be collected before they can actually do things. So it could be 2027 or later before the policy actually comes into play, which is not helping with certainty, and there's considerable continuing unhappiness from the institutional investors, as you might expect. Now, this has all become very uncertain for another reason, which you may or may not know about Scottish politics, but the Green Party has left the government. They actually haven't left. They were removed by the Scottish National Party, and that actually led to the downfall of the First Minister. We have a new First Minister in Scotland as a result of that process. But the housing bill had already been issued. It's already been debated in Parliament. So the policy which reflects the interests of the Green Party is still the policy in the legislation. And what's not clear at the moment is whether that will remain the case or whether there'll be amendments to the bill, which might change the nature of the rent control element. So that's why I described it as a very fluid situation that we find ourselves in. So just some wider thoughts. I've just got a couple of slides left. First of all, it's been an interesting experience. We're the only part of the UK which has attempted to introduce rent control since 1988. And what we've seen are very rapidly established polarized perspectives on rent control. We've seen attempts to use different generations. We've had this really interesting episode of the freeze and cap that followed after autumn 2022, which is really a sense a throwback to COVID times, where government was able to enact quite strong measures. And I think so, for instance, they banned evictions throughout the period of COVID. And perhaps this is the relative success with that encouraged ministers to do something like this. I think there's still a real absence of a vision for the private rented sector in Scotland that reflects the segments that it has and the different things that it does. And I'm personally concerned that if there's to be rent controls, there needs to be a really strong basis of market analysis at a local level to really understand what's happening in rental markets and their segments. And it's not clear to me that what's in the bill at the moment goes nearly far enough. There's no training provision. There's no kind of market analysis framework, nothing like that at all. So that's a real concern. So in a sense, it addresses symptoms and it really lacks complementary policies. We're also operating in a context where social housing supply budgets have been cut by 26% and threaten the kind of targets that the government has for affordable supply. So my last slide. From an academic point of view, we've been really quite heavily involved, as I said, particularly in the early days of the national rent control policy, and we just continue to give evidence in Parliament and talk to civil servants, politicians about rent control. So we've been struck by the kind of ethnography of being in that process of trying to be neutral and independent. but also the sense, I think, that with a paper in the International Journal of Housing Policy in 2022, where we kind of argued that it's much harder to actually convince politicians that of the policy will stop. But once they have made an initial decision about the policy, you can use evidence to kind of frame and shape and debate with them the precise nature of the policy. But we've always argued that policy design has been a bit of a shortcoming here. I've been really struck by these multiple perspectives and how people read the evidence as well, in fact. And I think just the final thing I would say is, in terms of the broader lessons that might be learned from what Scotland's been experiencing since broadly 2017, is how political this becomes very quickly when you don't have much personal direct experience of these kind of policies in the recent past, and you rely very heavily on international evidence, which you don't necessarily filter successfully, and absolutely that you have to work really hard to think about policy design and the consequences of rent control policies. That there's nothing intrinsically wrong with such policies, but it's how they fit into the wider housing system and how they operate alongside complementary policies. But I think we haven't seen enough of those kinds of levels of analysis thus far. And I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ken. Are there any questions in the audience? Also online? Well, I have one question. So, as far as I understood, the rent pressure zones didn't work. So now Scotland is thinking, or a certain part of the society in Scotland is thinking about reintroducing it under new SOS, so to speak, as the second version, but it's completely uncertain whether and when and how it will be implemented.
That's a fair summary, yes.
Okay, thank you.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's yeah. So it shows some evidence of learning. I mean, they recognise that it needs to encapsulate the whole market. They recognise, as we've been saying all along, that they need to have much better data, and the landlord register was the obvious way to do that. And they've created an incentive structure whereby landlords are fined if they don't provide the data. But it will all take time. It's great, but also, as I said earlier, that there's a broader need for market analysis. It's not enough to collect rents. You have to know what to do with them. You know, you need to be able to place them in a market context and understand, you know, how the market functions. And they don't seem to have got that far yet.
In this case, it seems that the lack of data protects Scotland from introduction of rent control.
Well, a lack of willingness to invest in data, certainly. But yeah, so it's highly uncertain, and of course that doesn't suit anybody, as we all know. Nobody likes uncertainty in these kind of markets and scenarios. But also, the other side of the coin is that we have a UK social security system that operates in Scotland and has very low levels of benefit for private tenants, and the Scottish government doesn't have any power over that, and that's a real problem. So there's a real affordability issue. I mean, rents are rising rapidly, but the only data we have are for new rents, for adverts associated with new rents, which we can have any kind of confidence in. But that is really difficult for people who are benefit dependent, and it's often people in low income work. So they're paying very high levels of affordability ratios, etc. It's a really difficult issue.
Okay, thanks a lot.
Yeah.
So today we are very perfect in terms of time management. So now those who are here are going to have a nice lunch, and those who are online probably too, depending on the time zone where you're located. So see you within 1 hour. Bye.